Hi everyone, in this video we are going to discuss the food and the planet, but specifically we are going to address the global production of meat. But we're going to do this by analyzing three different graphs that were provided to us by the FAO. So let's start off by discussing what the FAO is. And so this is actually a good one that I would just straight up memorize if you can. So the FAO, it is the Food and Agriculture Organization. And if you knew that, that's probably okay, but because we are going to be using this and referencing this for the rest of the module, I would like for you to know the actual full name. And so the FAO is actually the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. Okay, and so the last part is what gives it a little bit of credibility to the fact that we are actually going out and gathering all this information across the globe of where everybody's getting their food and how exactly they're doing it, so their techniques. And so the first thing I want to look at is the world average meat consumption. So let's label this. This is the world average meat consumption. All right, so the first thing we can see is that our x-axis is at 3 different years, okay? So the first one on the left is from 64 to 66, the middle one is 97 to 99, and then the last one and the one all the way on the right is what's projected to be our average meat consumption in the year 2030. And so what we can see is we've kind of slowly just increased with this trend where our beef category hasn't really gotten too much bigger. We definitely are seeing an increase in our pork, and we are absolutely seeing an increase in our consumption of poultry, okay? So just to kind of give you an idea, the one thing that I found was really interesting was that in 97 and 99, people were eating a lot of sheep and goat, but by the year 2030, we think that's not going to happen so much anymore. And hopefully by the end of this module, not this video, but the end of the module, you'll be able to kind of understand why some of these categories have increased and other ones have decreased. So that's the goal, so keep that in the back of your mind. And just for giving you another frame of reference, on the y-axis here, this is your kilograms of meat ingested per person per year. Okay, so it's annual consumption in kilograms. Now, at what cost? What does this actually mean? So we noticed that a lot of people are eating beef, but we noticed that we were expecting for a lot of people in the future to be eating poultry, and we're kind of curious why that is. So right now, what I'm looking at in this graph, on my x-axis, I see a number of different types of products, okay? So we see our beef, our pork, and our chicken. Those are the 3 ones I want you to look at. On our y-axis, we're looking at land area in meters squared, okay? So the first thing you should be able to identify is that poultry here right at the bottom, or our chicken, barely requires any land. So we're looking at about 14 meters squared, not too much. However, for beef and pork, we are up to 90 and all the way up to 245 meters squared, okay? So that's huge. A huge amount of land is required for beef and pork relative to chicken. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. So that even though we're eating just a small amount of beef, it is probably because it requires a lot of land in order to do this. Now, I want to make sure this is very clear because sometimes people look at this and see the milk and the beef and they get confused. In order to have a dairy farm, you're just using cattle that you can reuse over and over and over again. You can use the same cows. For a beef farm, you can't do that. You need new cows every time in order to, take the cow and use it as a form of meat or food, right? You can't reuse the cow, you can't reuse that meat. Once you eat it the first time, you're one and done. So you need a lot more land in order to have the cattle and actually raise it for a source of meat instead of a source of dairy, okay? Now, instead of looking at land, I want to focus on grain. So how much food is actually needed, specifically grain. Grain's the cheapest, it's usually what's used the most. So grain is needed in order to actually provide this food. So if we look at milk all the way on the left side, milk only requires 1.1 kilograms of grain, whereas if we look at something like beef, it is all the way up to 20 kilograms of grain. So, I mean, it's a lot. If overall, we can see that beef and pork require the most amount, whereas chicken, milk, and eggs are all down here at the very, very bottom, and they don't require that much. That goes for grain and for land, okay? So now, putting all of this together with what we eat, the amount of land it requires, and the amount of grain that requires, we result in 3 major things. All of these are negative drawbacks as a result of our farming and our agriculture. So this is across the globe, not just with the United States. Number 1, we have a loss of forest ecosystems. And we have this because we're trying to create land for agriculture. So basically, we're cutting down trees in order to create a clear piece of land in order to have some kind of agriculture and grow these other pieces, okay? So to try to have beef, to try to have chicken, milk, whatever it is, we have to cut down trees. So that's a big negative. Number 2, we have erosion of topsoil from overplanting. So basically using the same field over and over and over again with the same crop, but actually trying to maximize so you don't give any space. You're just putting as many different seeds down as you possibly can, and overgrazing. Okay, so now if you have a set amount of land, you have 7,000 cows out there that you're trying to raise in order to get their beef for the meat, you are going to have your cows constantly walking around and grazing on the same area, eating all your grass, so it's what's considered overgrazing. Both overplanting and overgrazing cause erosion of the topsoil, which we all know is terrible for us. Now, number 3, the last thing is your loss of biodiversity. Now, we've talked about the loss of biodiversity before in our oceans when we said our carbon dioxide was going into our ocean and it's making our oceans more acidic, okay, or ocean acidification has the same negative effect as it does here when we're talking about our agriculture. We see a loss of biodiversity, and so instead of carbon dioxide going in the ocean, here this is from the repeated planting of single crops. So now I'm from Michigan, and so what I can kind of attest to this aspect is that I know that every single time when I drive by this certain field, it's always, always, always going to be corn, or it's always going to be asparagus. They don't ever switch it up. It is always a corn field. So the bad thing you can do is just keep planting that same crop there over and over and over again. The good idea is to actually mix it up. So one year would be corn, the next year would be asparagus, the next year would be strawberries. Obviously that can't work all in the same ecosystem or all in the same geographical location, but in theory that's how it would work. So unfortunately, because we have people who are specialists, they're a crop farmer or they're an asparagus farmer, they do not switch up their crops, and so what ends up happening is we see a loss of biodiversity because we have this repeated process. So it's not good, but there's 3 things that we need to keep in the back of our mind of always what are happening because of our global production of meat and beef and chicken and everything, okay? So these are 3 things. Now, here's my question, okay? What type of meat, okay, I'm focusing on meat specifically, requires the most grain? Okay, and then the second question I want to ask is which type of meat, again, I'm still asking for meat only, requires the least amount of land? Most grain, least land. Go. All right, did you get an answer? Hopefully you did. All you had to do was scroll back up here and look at our graphs 2 and 3 that we put in this video and try to determine the answer. So the first thing I asked you is which one of these pieces of meat, okay, so our only options were chicken, pork, or beef, requires the most grain. The only thing that requires the most grain is definitely going to our beef. It requires 20 kilograms when pork only requires 7.3. Okay, so beef requires the most grain. The second question was which requires the least amount of land. So if we're looking at land or we're looking at least, we're looking at meat, we come all the way over here. The least amount of land is definitely going to be your chicken. All right, that's all I have for you today. Take care of yourself and eat your veggies.